Let's have a look at what happens when I duplicate an object. So if I set this back to its own axis, if I move this object around just by clicking on the y-axis and moving it, the object will move. And if I hold shift down, you can see that I get up this clone object option, and it says copy, instance and reference. And we really need to understand the difference between a copy and an instance, and a reference we're not going to worry too much about. And you can see by default it says it gives the object a unique name, and it's going to go and copy the object. So let's keep this object as a copy, and then let's go away and do a instance with this one. So this object is an instance and this object is a copy. And the difference between these on a technical level is that a copied object has all of its data in a separate area of memory, whereas an instance object shares its data with the original. And what this means is that if I take this object and let's change the number of height segments in this object, you can see that these two objects have the same number of height segments, even though I didn't change the height segments in this object. But this object that was a copy, it only has 4 height segments. It didn't change. Similarly, if I go in and change the height of this object, you can see that the instance object shares the height data. So the two objects have the same height, they have the same height segments, they have the same width. And this is very useful because it enables you to make multiple copies of an object and then adjust one object, and the instances of that object will adjust at the same time. So let's have a look at the practicalities of that and the fact that modifiers can also be instances. So I'm just going to select my objects and delete them. I'm going to make a box and a cylinder. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a modifier to this. So here's my bend, and as expected I can change the angle and the object will bend. I can also copy this modifier and I can paste either a copy or an instanced copy. And if I paste an instance copy, you'll see that it's in italics. And now if I change the angle of this modifier, it will change the angle of both objects. And if I shift copy this, and again I'm going to make it an instance, you will see that it keeps both the box and the bend as instances. So now if I go in and change the bend angle, it changes on all 3 objects. If I go into the box and I change the height segments on both boxes will change. If I go in and change the height of the box, I can adjust the height of the box. I can go in and change the bend angle. And you can see that the instances mean that these things are inherited constantly and they update in real time. So let's go and have a look at a practical use for that and look how we can do a lot of duplication of an object and create some very complicated shapes. So I'm going to make a box, and to begin with it's going to be a very simple box. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this box in a circle. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to open up my tools. I'm going to select my object. Going to open up Tools Array. And I'm going to attempt to rotate this object by 360 degrees. And just remembered the previous rotations that I've set. So I'm just going to switch this to, let's just say 90 degrees, which should be very clear. I'm going to hit preview, and we can see we've rotated this object 90 degrees, but we've rotated it around its own pivot. It says use pivot point center. Now it'd be handy if I could click on this and change it, but I can't. So I'm going to cancel that, and I'm going to change the pivot point to the last object, which is use transform center coordinate, which in this case will be the center of the world. So we can see that what I've got here is my pivot is now at the transform center, which for the view is going to be the origin. I'm going to go into tools and array, and I'm going to set preview, and then I can change the number of copies of the object it makes. So let's go for 12. Let's make 12 copies of this object. And you can see that the type of copy that I'm going to make, the type of object, is going to be an instance. And I've got preview shows me what it's going to do, and I'm okay. So I click OK, and I now have a whole group of objects. And remember, they're all instances. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift drag. So I'm going to select my Z-axis, I'm going to hold shift down, I'm going to drag. I'm going to make sure I select all my objects first and do that again. So I've got all my objects selected, I'm going to shift drag. And again, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to have an instance of this, and I'm going to make about 6 copies now. And what will happen is that initial movement I've made gets repeated 6 times, because that's what I said in the dialog box. So now I have a whole bunch of objects, and if I go to my modifier panel, you can see that they're all in bold. You can see that they're all going to be instances of that original box, and it really doesn't matter which box I select to edit, because they're all instances. So if I change the height segments to 2, the height segments for all the objects changes to 2. Okay, this is pretty cool. Now what happens if I add a modifier to this box? So I go to modifiers, I'm going to go to parametric, I'm going to go to bend, and you can see that it's added the bend modifier to everything. And now I can go and change the angle, and I can change the direction. And so, yep, I've got something that's pretty cool looking there. I'm going to go down to my box. I'm going to add some more height segments to make it a bit smoother. I'm going to go to that bend, and again, I'm just going to up the angle a little bit more, tweak it around. So you can see here that I've managed to create a much more complex and much more interesting shape, and it's duplicating throughout the copies and the instances of the object I've made. Okay, that's good. Now what happens if I select everything and I go and add another modifier? So this time I'm going to add myself the taper modifier, and now because I've selected a whole bunch of objects, it knows that that taper modifier is going to go around the collection of objects, not just the individuals. So let's just adjust the amount, let's just adjust the curve. And there we go. So you can see that I've created a nice new complicated shape from a very simple shape that I have duplicated using both the array and using a shift offset, and then changing the number of copies it's made. Again, I'm going to go into the modifiers. Again, I've got all the objects selected. I'm going to add a twist modifier, go in again, and it's twisting all of the objects, and the twist is being applied to all the objects as a single unit. And then finally, okay, what if I go in and I select just these objects? Can I do something with a modifier to these objects? So let's go in, let's look at our modifiers. Let's do a stretch with these, and let's change that stretch parameter and let's move them up a little bit. And again, what I've managed to do is to create an interesting, complicated shape from a very simple object. And if I go back down the stack to the box, again, because everything is parametric here, I can change the height segments. I can change them up and down. I can change the width and the length segments. I can change the length of the object and the width of the object. Let's turn off the wireframe so that we can see what we're getting without being distracted by what the wireframes are doing. And again, anything that I add to the stack at this point, so say I want to make an adjustment after the bend, let's go back into modifiers, let's look at another parametric modifier. Let's do the lattice because that will be really obvious. So I'm just going to add struts to my lattice. And again, this lattice modifier has, because it's at the base level and it's being copied up the stack because it's an instance, it gets propagated to all the objects that are instances of it. I can turn it off if I want to.